You feel shattered by life's relentless blows, watching pieces of yourself scatter with each setback and disappointment. Every failure cuts deeper than the last, leaving you questioning whether you have the strength to rebuild from the fragments of who you once were. I am Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who found unbreakable strength while carrying the weight of an empire through plague, war, and personal tragedy. For nearly 2 decades, I ruled Rome during its darkest hours, yet discovered that true power comes not from avoiding brokenness, but from forging something stronger in the fire of our struggles. The stoic wisdom I'll share will transform how you view your darkest moments, showing you that what feels like destruction is actually reconstruction. The same philosophy that sustained me through the collapse of everything I held dear can teach you to see brokenness not as your end, but as your beginning. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world needs to remember its unbreakable nature. When I first became emperor in 161 AD, I believed that power meant controlling circumstances. I was 39 years old, trained in philosophy since childhood, prepared for leadership through careful study under Antoninus Pius, yet no amount of education or preparation could have readied me for what came next. The plague arrived like a whisper that became a scream. At first, just reports from distant provinces and usual deaths, strange symptoms among the legions returning from Parthia. I remember sitting in my private study, reading the initial dispatches by lamplight, thinking this was merely another administrative challenge to be managed through careful planning and resource allocation. How naive I was. Within months, the whisper became a roar that consumed the empire. The Antonine Plague, as history would name it, swept through our cities like a divine punishment. Bodies piled in the streets of Rome itself. The very air seemed poisoned. Citizens fled to the countryside, abandoning their duties, their trades, their responsibilities. The economy collapsed as fear paralyzed commerce. I watched my empire, the greatest civilization the world had ever known, crumble before my eyes, not through conquest or rebellion, but through an invisible enemy that respected neither rank nor virtue. Senators died alongside slaves. Philosophers perished as quickly as the ignorant. The plague mocked every human pretension to control. In those dark months, I felt truly broken for the first time in my life. Not because I suffered physically, though I grieved deeply for every lost citizen, but because everything I believed about leadership, about the power of human reason and planning, seemed utterly useless. I had been given the greatest responsibility on earth, and I was helpless to protect those entrusted to my care. I spent sleepless nights pacing the marble floors of my chambers, questioning everything. Was this divine retribution for some unknown failing? Had I been wrong to accept the purple? Was I unworthy of the throne that Antoninus had passed to me with such confidence? But it was in those moments of deepest questioning that I discovered something profound. The plague could kill my citizens, cripple my economy, and shatter my plans, but it could not touch something deeper within me. There remained a center that was unassailable, a fortress that no external catastrophe could breach. I began to understand that the empire I truly ruled was not the physical territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, but the territory of my own mind and character. External circumstances, plague, war, political upheaval could shake everything around me, but they could only break me if I allowed them access to that inner citadel. This realization changed everything. Instead of feeling victimized by circumstances beyond my control, I began to see them as opportunities to practice virtue. Each day brought new disasters, new impossible decisions, new reasons to disparage. Each day became a chance to respond with wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline rather than panic, cowardice, selfishness, and indulgence. The plague continued to rage, But I was no longer broken by it. I had learned the first great lesson that would sustain me through 20 years of unimaginable challenges. External events have no power over the essential self, unless we grant them that power. The weight of empire could crush my body, but my spirit remained sovereign. Asterisk, asterisk, the Germanic tribes had been testing our borders for years. But in 166 AD, they broke through like a dam bursting. The Marcomanni Quadi and their allies poured across the Danube in numbers we had never seen. For the first time in over 2 centuries, barbarian armies threatened Italy itself. I had no choice but to take personal command of the legions. Philosophy was a luxury I could no longer afford, or so I thought. I traded my study for a command tent, my books for battle plans, my meditations for the brutal reality of warfare. The campaign lasted 15 years. 15 years of watching young men die under my orders. 15 years of making decisions that sent thousands to their deaths, for the sake of millions more. 15 years of carrying the weight of every fallen soldier on my conscience. I remember one night particularly clearly. We were camped along the Danube, deep in enemy territory. The winter had been harsh, and we had lost more men to cold and disease than 2 Germanic spears. I was reviewing casualty reports by the flickering light of oil lamps, when my aide brought news that shattered what remained of my composure. A cohort of young recruits, barely 18 years old. Most of them had been ambushed while foraging. 43 killed, 17 wounded, 6 missing and presumed captured. I knew their centurion personally. I had spoken with many of these boys just days before, asking about their families, their hopes for after the campaign. Now they were names on a death scroll. I dismissed my staff and sat alone in my tent, surrounded by maps marked with the positions of living men who might be dead tomorrow because of orders I would give. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Every decision I made rippled outward, determining who would see another sunrise and who would not. That night, I broke. Not physically, I remained outwardly composed, as an emperor must, but inside, something fundamental cracked. I questioned everything: my right to send men to die, the justice of our cause, the value of preserving an empire built on conquest and maintained through violence. Was I a protector of civilization, or simply another warlord dressed in purple? I wept that night, something I had not done since childhood. I wept for those dead boys, for their mothers who would never see them again, for the Germanic warriors we had killed who were defending their own homes and families. I wept for the impossible burden of leadership and for my own inadequacy in bearing it. But in that breaking, I discovered something extraordinary. The tears were not a sign of weakness. They were proof of my humanity. The weight I carried was not punishment, but privilege. The pain I felt was not meaningless suffering, but the necessary cost of caring deeply about something greater than myself. I realized that feeling broken by the magnitude of responsibility was not a failure of character, but evidence of moral sensitivity. A leader who could send men to die without feeling the weight of those decisions would be a monster, not a philosopher king. From that night forward, I approached command differently. I still made the hard decisions. War demanded nothing less, but I made them with full awareness of their human cost. I carried the grief of every loss, not as a burden that weakened me, but as a sacred responsibility that strengthened my resolve to fight only when absolutely necessary and to end conflicts as quickly as possible. The breaking had taught me that what feels like destruction can actually be reconstruction. My naive confidence in easy answers had been shattered, replaced by a deeper, more nuanced understanding of leadership and responsibility. I had been broken by the reality of command, but that breaking had forged me into a better emperor and a wiser man. Most importantly, I learned that the capacity to feel broken is itself a strength. Only those who can be moved by suffering have the moral authority to try to prevent it. Only those who feel the weight of responsibility deeply enough to be crushed by it are worthy of bearing it. Asterisk, asterisk. After that night of breaking, I began a practice that would sustain me through every subsequent trial. Each morning before dawn, while the camp still slept, and the only sounds were the crackling of dying fires and the murmur of sentries changing guard, I would sit in meditation and examine my thoughts. This was not the abstract, philosophical exercise I had practiced in my youth, but something far more urgent and practical. I was learning to build what I came to think of as an inner citadel, fortress within my mind that could withstand any assault from external circumstances. The Germanic campaigns had taught me a crucial lesson. While I could not control what happened to me, I retained absolute sovereignty over how I responded to what happened. Enemy armies could threaten my borders, plagues could devastate my cities, political rivals could challenge my authority, but none of these external forces could compel me to abandon my principles or surrender my inner peace unless I chose to. Let them. I began each day by reminding myself of this fundamental truth. You have power over your mind, not outside events, I would tell myself. Realize this, and you will find strength. These words became my morning prayer, my daily armor, against whatever catastrophes the day might bring. The practice was deceptively simple, but profoundly transformative. When reports arrived of another military setback, instead of immediately reacting with anger or despair, I would pause and ask myself, what aspect of this situation is actually within my control? Usually, the answer was, my response to the situation, nothing more. This shift in focus changed everything. Instead of wasting energy raging against circumstances I could not alter, I channeled that energy into the areas where I could make a difference. I could not prevent soldiers from dying, but I could ensure that their deaths served a meaningful purpose. I could not stop political intrigue, but I could respond to it with justice rather than vengeance. The inner citadel was not a place of withdrawal from the world, but a foundation for more effective engagement with it. By securing my inner peace, I became more capable of serving the external world, not less. A mind at war with itself cannot wage war effectively against external enemies. I discovered that this fortress had several chambers, each requiring daily maintenance. The first was the chamber of acceptance, learning to align my will with reality rather than demanding that reality conform to my preferences. The second was the chamber of virtue, remembering that my character was the only thing of ultimate value, more precious than my life, my throne, or my reputation. The third chamber was perspective, the ability to see present troubles in the context of the vastness of time and space. When I felt overwhelmed by immediate pressures, I would remind myself that the universe was ancient before Rome existed and would continue long after it fell. This was not nihilism, but liberation. It freed me to focus on what I could control, without being paralyzed by the magnitude of what I could not. The fourth chamber was gratitude, the recognition that even in the midst of catastrophe, much remained worthy of appreciation. I had the honor of serving something greater than myself. I had the opportunity to practice virtue under pressure. I had been given challenges that would forge me into a stronger, wiser man. The final chamber was purpose, the understanding that my trials were not meaningless suffering, but opportunities to fulfill my role in the cosmic order. Every difficulty was a chance to demonstrate that a rational being could maintain virtue regardless of circumstances. This inner citadel became my true home. I could be physically present in a military camp on the Danube frontier, in the Senate house in Rome, or in the imperial palace, but my real residence was this internal sanctuary that no external force could breach. Building this fortress required daily discipline. Like maintaining any fortification, some days the walls felt strong and impregnable. Other days they seemed paper-thin, barely holding back the chaos pressing against them. But even on my weakest days, I had learned that the citadel could not be destroyed, only temporarily abandoned. The key insight was that this inner strength was not a feeling but a choice. I did not need to feel strong to be strong. I did not need to feel peaceful to maintain peace of mind. Strength and peace were decisions I could make regardless of my emotional state, acts of will rather than accidents of circumstance. The most powerful discovery I made during those years of warfare was that events themselves are neutral. It is our judgments about events that create our suffering or our strength. A military defeat could be seen as a catastrophe or as valuable intelligence about enemy tactics. A personal betrayal could be viewed as devastating proof that the world is unjust, or as an opportunity to practice forgiveness and to learn better judgment about character. I remember a particular incident that crystallized this understanding. One of my most trusted generals, a man I had considered both an ally and a friend, had been discovered taking bribes from Germanic chieftains and passing military intelligence to the enemy. His betrayal had cost us a major battle and hundreds of Roman lives. My initial reaction was exactly what you might expect: rage, disappointment, a sense of personal violation. I felt foolish for having trusted him, angry at his greed and disloyalty, devastated by the soldiers who had died because of his treachery. For days I nursed these emotions, feeding them with repeated mental rehearsals of his crimes and fantasies of revenge. But then I caught myself in this destructive pattern and asked a simple question: what is actually happening here? Stripped of my emotional judgments, the facts were these: a man had chosen personal gain over duty. Soldiers had died. I now possessed valuable information about both the enemy's resources and my own army's vulnerabilities. That was all. Everything else, the sense of betrayal, the wounded pride, the anger, these were additions I was making to the basic facts. Once I separated the event from my interpretation of it, I could respond more wisely. Instead of wasting energy on rage, I could focus on practical matters: securing our intelligence networks, adjusting our defensive strategies, and using this betrayal as a teaching moment about the importance of virtue under pressure. More importantly, I could examine what this incident revealed about my own character. Had I been naive in my trust? Perhaps, but naivety is preferable to cynicism. Had I failed to notice warning signs? Possibly, and this failure could teach me to be more observant without becoming suspicious. Was I devastated by his betrayal? Yes, but this devastation proved that I still cared deeply about loyalty and virtue, qualities worth preserving even at the cost of occasional disappointment. This practice of perception discipline became central to my daily routine. Whenever I faced a challenging situation, I would strip away my initial emotional reaction and examine what was actually present. A political setback became data about the balance of power in the Senate. An illness became information about the fragility of the body and the importance of focusing on what was permanent rather than temporary. A criticism became insight into how others perceived my actions and an opportunity to examine my motivations. The key was learning to see obstacles as material for virtue rather than impediments to happiness. Every difficulty contained the seeds of its own solution if I could perceive it clearly enough. A crisis in grain distribution was not just a problem to be solved, but an opportunity to demonstrate justice and foresight. A rebellion in a distant province was not just a military challenge, but a chance to practice clemency and wisdom in victory. I began to understand that the same event could be either a source of strength or a cause of suffering, depending entirely on how I chose to perceive it. Rain could ruin a military campaign or provide much-needed relief from summer heat. The death of a close advisor could be a devastating loss or a reminder to appreciate those who remained and an inspiration to carry forward their best qualities. This discipline of perception required constant vigilance. The mind naturally gravitates toward interpretations that justify our emotions rather than interpretations that serve our growth. We prefer to see ourselves as victims of circumstance rather than as active participants in shaping our response to circumstance. But with practice, I learned to catch these distorted perceptions quickly and replace them with more accurate ones. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" I learned to ask, "How can I use this experience to become wiser, stronger, and more virtuous?" The shift in questions led to a complete transformation in how I experienced even the most challenging circumstances. The true test of character comes not in moments of triumph, but in the ruins of our plans and dreams. I learned this most profoundly during the winter of 170 AD, when everything I had worked to build seemed to crumble simultaneously. The Germanic coalition had broken through our defenses and penetrated deep into Roman territory. Aquila itself was under siege, the first time a barbarian army had threatened an Italian city since the days of the Cimbri. Meanwhile, rebellion had erupted in Egypt under Avidius Cassius, who proclaimed himself emperor based on false reports of my death. The plague continued its relentless advance, now claiming victims even within my own household. Standing in my command tent that winter, reading dispatches that brought only bad news, I felt the weight of complete failure. Every strategy had backfired. Every plan had been shattered by unforeseen circumstances. The empire I had inherited seemed to be dissolving under my leadership. In that moment of deepest despair, I could have abandoned virtue entirely. What use was justice when barbarians respected only strength? What value was temperance when the empire was burning? What good was wisdom when every wise decision led to disaster? What point was courage when courage seemed to accomplish nothing? But it was precisely in those ruins that I discovered virtue's true nature. Virtue is not a tool for achieving external success, is the only success that matters when everything else has failed. When my military strategies collapsed, I could still choose to treat prisoners with justice. When my political alliances crumbled, I could still respond to betrayal with dignity rather than vengeance. When my personal losses mounted, I could still face them with courage rather than despair. I remember the moment this understanding crystallized. News had arrived that a Germanic warband had overrun a small frontier town, killing most of the inhabitants and enslaving the rest. My generals urged an immediate retaliatory strike against Germanic settlements, arguing that only savage response to savage acts could restore Roman prestige. Every instinct screamed for revenge. These barbarians had murdered Roman citizens under my protection. They had violated every principle of civilized warfare. They deserved to suffer as they had made others suffer. But in that moment of rage, I asked myself a different question. Not what these barbarians deserved, but what kind of man I chose to be. Would I let their brutality make me brutal? Would I let their abandonment of virtue justify my own? Or would I hold fast to my principles precisely because others had abandoned theirs? I chose virtue, even in the ruins of my military situation. Instead of ordering indiscriminate retaliation, I commanded surgical strikes against military targets only, with strict orders to spare non-combatants. My officers thought me weak. My enemies likely saw it as softness. But I had preserved something more valuable than tactical advantage, had preserved my character. This decision taught me that virtue flourishes most when circumstances are worst. Anyone can be just when justice costs nothing. Anyone can be temperate when desires are easily satisfied. Anyone can be courageous when victory is assured. But true virtue emerges when virtue itself seems pointless, when doing right brings no reward except the satisfaction of having done right. In the ruins of our plans, we discover what we truly value. External goods, wealth, reputation, power, even life itself can all be stripped away, but virtue remains. Character endures. The choice to act rightly exists even when right action seems futile. I began to see my trials not as obstacles to virtue, but as opportunities for virtue. Each setback became a chance to practice resilience. Each betrayal became an occasion for forgiveness. Each loss became a moment to demonstrate that what matters most cannot be lost unless we choose to abandon it. The empire eventually stabilized. The Germanic tribes were pushed back across the Danube. The Egyptian rebellion collapsed when Cassius was assassinated by his own officers. The plague finally ran its course. But these external victories were less important than the internal victory I had won by choosing virtue, even when virtue seemed meaningless. Years later, reflecting on that dark winter, I realized that my greatest accomplishment was not saving the empire, but saving my soul. In the ruins of my plans, I had built something indestructible, the knowledge that virtue is its own reward, and that no external circumstance can take from us what we refuse to surrender. The ancient myths speak of the phoenix, the magnificent bird that builds its own funeral pyre and rises reborn from the ashes. For years, I dismissed this as mere fantasy till I became the phoenix myself. My transformation did not happen in a single dramatic moment, but through countless small deaths and rebirths. Each time circumstances broke me down, I discovered that what emerged from the destruction was stronger than what had been destroyed. The naive young emperor who had believed in easy solutions died during the plague years. The idealistic philosopher who thought virtue would be rewarded with success died during the Germanic wars. The man who sought approval and feared criticism died when I learned that doing right often means standing alone. Yet from each of these deaths, something better was born. The naive emperor became a wise ruler who understood that leadership means carrying impossible burdens with grace. The idealistic philosopher became a practical sage who knew that virtue was tested by adversity, not rewarded by it. The approval-seeking man became a leader who could act on principle regardless of popular opinion. I began to understand that what we call being broken is often simply the first stage of becoming something greater. The caterpillar must dissolve completely before it can become a butterfly. The seed must die before it can become a tree. And we must be willing to let our smaller selves perish before our larger selves can emerge. This process requires a fundamental shift in how we view destruction and renewal. Most people fear breakdown because they identify completely with their current form. When their job is threatened, they feel their entire identity is at risk. When their relationships fail, they believe they are failures. When their plans collapse, they see themselves as broken. But I learned to view myself not as a fixed entity that could be damaged, but as a process of continuous becoming. Each setback was not damage to something static, but raw material for something new. Each failure was not an ending, but a transformation. Each moment of brokenness was not a defeat, but a rebirth. This understanding changed how I approached every crisis. When the Senate challenged my authority, instead of seeing it as an attack on my power, I saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate leadership through persuasion rather than force. When physical illness reminded me of my mortality, instead of viewing it as weakness, I saw it as motivation to focus on what was eternal rather than temporary. When personal losses broke my heart, instead of seeing them as pure tragedy, I saw them as deepening my capacity for compassion. The key insight was that the phoenix does not merely survive its destruction, it participates in it. The bird builds its own pyre. It chooses the flames that will transform it. Similarly, we can learn to embrace the processes that break us down, recognizing them as necessary steps toward becoming who we are meant to be. This does not mean seeking out suffering or remaining passive in the face of genuine problems. The phoenix builds its pyre with intention and wisdom, not randomly or carelessly. We too must be strategic about which battles we fight and which defeats we accept. But when breakdown comes, as it inevitably does, we can meet it not as victims, but as participants in our own renewal. I began to see my entire reign as a series of phoenix cycles. Each crisis destroyed some aspect of my previous understanding and replaced it with deeper wisdom. Each challenge burned away another layer of illusion and revealed more of the truth underneath. Each moment of feeling broken was actually a moment of becoming more whole. The broken emperor who wept in his tent after reading casualty reports became the wise leader who could make difficult decisions with both strength and compassion. The shattered man who questioned everything became the philosopher who found meaning in uncertainty itself. The ruler who felt crushed by responsibility became the servant who found joy in carrying others' burdens. Looking back now, I can see that my greatest moments of apparent destruction were actually my greatest moments of creation. What felt like endings were beginnings. What seemed like failures were foundations. What appeared to be breakdowns were breakthroughs. The phoenix does not fear the flames, because it knows that fire is not its enemy, but its transformation. Once you understand this truth, that every ending contains a beginning, every death enables a birth, every breaking opens space for something better, you become unbreakable in the deepest sense. Not because nothing can hurt you, but because you know that what hurts you also heals you. What destroys you also creates you. What breaks you also makes you. ****, nothing prepared me for the death of my son, Annus Verus, at age 7, nor for watching my beloved wife Faustina waste away from fever, nor for receiving the daily reports of plague victims that turned Roman citizens into mere numbers on death scrolls. Yet these encounters with mortality became my greatest teachers in the art of living unbroken. When Annus died, I felt something in me die as well. He had been bright, curious, full of the questions that only children ask with perfect seriousness. I had imagined teaching him philosophy, watching him grow into manhood, perhaps even passing the imperial throne to him one day. All those futures died with him in a single night of fever. I rage at the gods. I questioned everything I believed about justice and order in the universe. If virtue was truly rewarded and good people protected, why was an innocent child taken, while murderers and tyrants lived on? What meaning could there be in a cosmos that allowed such arbitrary cruelty? For months, I carried this grief like a physical weight. Every morning I woke hoping the previous day had been a nightmare. Every evening I fell asleep, exhausted by the effort of functioning while my heart felt carved hollow. I went through the motions of ruling while feeling utterly empty inside. But gradually, I began to understand that this confrontation with mortality was not punishment, but education. Death strips away every illusion about what matters and what doesn't. Facing the impermanence of everything I loved forced me to appreciate what remained while it remained. I realized that my suffering came not from Agnes's death itself, but from my refusal to accept that death is woven into the very fabric of existence. I had been living as if the people I loved were permanent possessions rather than temporary gifts. I had been acting as if I could control outcomes that were never within my control to begin with. This acceptance did not diminish my love for my son or reduce my grief to mere philosophy, but it transformed how I carried that grief. Instead of raging against the natural order, I began to honor it. Instead of seeing death as the enemy of life, I began to understand it as life's most honest teacher. Every morning now, I remind myself that this day might be my last, not to create anxiety, but to intensify appreciation. The face I see in my bronze mirror will not look back forever. The voice that speaks my thoughts will one day fall silent. The hands that write these words will eventually still. This remembrance of mortality does not make life meaningless, but infinitely precious. When you know that your time with someone is limited, you waste less of it on petty grievances. When you understand that your opportunities are finite, You choose more carefully which ones to pursue. When you accept that everything you build will eventually crumble, you focus on building things that matter while they exist. I began to see impermanence not as life's flaw, but as its fundamental feature. The cherry blossom is beautiful precisely because it blooms briefly. The sunset moves us because it fades. Human love is precious because it cannot last forever. If everything were permanent, nothing would be special. More importantly, accepting impermanence liberated me from the exhausting effort of trying to make temporary things permanent. I stopped clinging desperately to relationships, achievements, and possessions. Instead, I learned to hold them lightly, appreciating them fully while they lasted and releasing them gracefully when their time ended. This understanding transformed how I experienced every form of loss. Political defeats became temporary setbacks rather than permanent failures. Physical ailments became reminders of my humanity rather than threats to my identity. Even the eventual fall of Rome itself, which I knew must come someday, became simply another turn in the great wheel of time rather than a cosmic tragedy. Death taught me that the only tragedy is to live as if we were immortal, wasting our precious days on trivial pursuits and petty conflicts. The only wisdom is to live each moment fully while knowing it will not last forever. The only courage is to love deeply while accepting that everything we love will eventually be taken from us. When you truly accept impermanence, you become unbreakable in a paradoxical way. You cannot be devastated by loss because you never expected permanence. You cannot be crushed by change because you understand that change is the only constant. You cannot be broken by death because you have made peace with mortality. Asterisk, asterisk, for most of my early life, I believed that strength meant fighting against unwanted circumstances. When problems arose, I attacked them with strategy and will. When people opposed me, I marshaled arguments and authority to overcome their resistance. When fate brought unwelcome events, I exhausted myself trying to force different outcomes. This approach occasionally succeeded, but it left me perpetually at war with reality. I was constantly swimming against currents that were stronger than I was, wearing myself out in battles that could never be truly won. Even when I achieved temporary victories, new challenges immediately arose to replace the ones I had conquered. The revelation came during the final years of the Germanic campaigns. We had been fighting the same enemies in the same territories for over a decade. Every season brought fresh invasions. Every treaty was broken within months. Every victory was followed by new defeats. I began to understand that I was not fighting human enemies, but wrestling with the fundamental nature of existence itself. Sitting in my tent one evening, reviewing intelligence reports that told the same story they had told for years, I asked myself a different question. Instead of asking how to defeat these circumstances, what if I asked how to work with them? The shift in perspective was revolutionary. Instead of seeing the Germanic tribes as obstacles to be destroyed, I began to see them as a natural force to be channeled, like a river that cannot be stopped but can be directed. Their pressure on our borders was a reality that could be managed but not eliminated. This led to a completely different strategic approach. Instead of trying to conquer territory that we could not hold, we focused on creating buffer zones and client relationships. Instead of seeking total victory, we pursued sustainable stability. Instead of fighting the current, we learned to navigate it. But the deeper lesson was personal rather than military. I discovered that acceptance is not passive resignation, but active cooperation with reality. When we accept what cannot be changed, we free up enormous energy to focus on what can be influenced. When we stop wasting effort on impossible goals, we become far more effective at achieving possible ones. This principle applied to every aspect of life. I could not change the fact that some senators would always oppose my policies, but I could change how I responded to their opposition. I could not prevent natural disasters from affecting the empire, but I could control how efficiently we responded to them. I could not stop people from disappointing me, but I could stop being disappointed by human nature. The practice of acceptance required daily discipline. My natural instinct was still to resist unwanted circumstances, to demand that the world conform to my preferences rather than aligning my will with reality. But each time I caught myself in this futile struggle, I would pause and ask, what am I trying to control that is actually beyond my control? Usually, the answer was other people's choices, natural events, the passage of time, or the consequences of past decisions. Once I identified these areas of powerlessness, I could redirect my energy toward my responses, my preparations, my attitudes, and my future choices, where my influence was real and immediate. This shift transformed my relationship with stress and frustration. Instead of seeing obstacles as problems to be eliminated, I began to see them as information to be processed. A political setback told me something about the balance of power in Rome. A natural disaster revealed weaknesses in our infrastructure. A personal betrayal taught me lessons about character assessment. Acceptance did not mean becoming passive or indifferent. I still worked diligently to improve circumstances where improvement was possible, but I no longer exhausted myself trying to achieve the impossible or control the uncontrollable. I learned to apply my efforts strategically, focusing on areas where effort would actually make a difference. The strength that came from this acceptance was unlike any power I had previously known. It was not the brittle strength of resistance, which could be shattered by overwhelming force. It was the fluid strength of water, which yields to hard obstacles while gradually wearing them away. It was the enduring strength of mountains, which remained unmoved by storms while allowing wind and rain to flow around them. Most importantly, I discovered that acceptance is itself a choice, perhaps the most important choice we make. Every moment, we can choose to align our will with reality or to exhaust ourselves fighting against it. Every day, we can choose to work with the materials that life provides or to waste energy wishing we had been given different materials. When you truly master acceptance, you become unbreakable because you are no longer brittle. You bend without breaking, yield without surrendering, adapt without compromising your essential principles. You find strength not in resistance, but in resilience, not in rigidity, but in flexibility. Asterisk, asterisk, of all the battles I fought as emperor, none was more fierce or more important than the battle against my own inner critic. While I learned to extend mercy to enemies of the state and patience to incompetent officials, I remained merciless toward my own failures and imperfections. This internal warfare nearly destroyed me before I learned that self-compassion is not weakness, but the foundation of all true strength. My greatest enemy was not Germanic tribes or political rivals, but the voice in my head that catalogued every mistake, magnified every shortcoming, and demanded impossible perfection. When a military strategy failed, this voice would torment me for days with visions of alternate decisions that might have saved lives. When a policy produced unintended consequences, it would replay every moment of the decision-making process, highlighting each point where better judgment might have prevailed. This internal prosecutor was relentless. It allowed no rest, no forgiveness, no recognition that wisdom comes through experience rather than divine inspiration. It demanded that I should have known better, done better, been better regardless of the information available at the time or the pressures under which decisions were made. The breaking point came after a particularly costly military engagement, where my orders had led to an ambush that decimated 2 cohorts. The tactical situation had been complex, intelligence had been incomplete, and rapid decisions had been necessary. Any reasonable analysis would have concluded that I had made the best choice available given the circumstances. But my inner critic recognized no such mitigating factors. For weeks, I could barely function. I replayed the engagement obsessively, torturing myself with fantasies of different commands that might have yielded different outcomes. I lost sleep, appetite, and the ability to concentrate on current challenges. The empire demanded my attention, but I was trapped in a prison of self-recrimination. Finally, exhausted by this internal war, I asked myself a simple question. Would I treat any other person the way I was treating myself? If a subordinate had made the same decision under the same circumstances, would I subject them to the same merciless judgment? The answer was obvious. I would have acknowledged the difficulty of the situation, recognized the impossibility of perfect information, and focused on learning lessons for the future, rather than dwelling on unchangeable past events. I would have shown understanding for human limitations and appreciation for good intentions, even when outcomes were tragic. Why, then, was I denying myself the same basic compassion I would extend to anyone else? I began to understand that self-compassion is not self-indulgence, but self-preservation. The inner critic that I had mistaken for a guardian of standards was actually sabotaging my ability to serve effectively. By exhorting me with guilt and shame, it prevented me from learning from mistakes and moving forward with wisdom gained through experience. I started treating myself as I would treat a valued advisor who had made an error in judgment. I acknowledged the mistake without denying it, examined what had led to the poor decision, extracted lessons that could prevent similar errors in the future, and then moved on to the challenges that required immediate attention. This shift required constant vigilance. The habit of self-attack was deeply ingrained, reinforced by years of believing that harsh self-judgment was evidence of high standards. But gradually, I learned to catch the inner critic before it could gain momentum, replacing its harsh voice with the kind of rational analysis I would apply to any other person's actions. Self-compassion did not make me complacent or lower my standards. If anything, it raised them by creating an environment where honest self-assessment was possible. When I was not afraid of brutal self-punishment for every imperfection, I could acknowledge weaknesses more readily and address them more effectively. I discovered that the same energy I had been wasting on self-attack could be redirected toward self-improvement. Instead of spending hours rehearsing past failures, I could spend that time developing better strategies for future challenges. Instead of paralyzing myself with shame, I could motivate myself with compassionate determination to do better. Most importantly, I learned that self-compassion expands our capacity for compassion toward others. When we accept our own humanity, our limitations, mistakes, and imperfections, we become more understanding of these same qualities in other people. When we treat ourselves with kindness, we have more kindness available for the world around us. The emperor who had learned to forgive himself became more effective at governing others, not through weakness, but through wisdom. Understanding my own struggles with fear, anger, and confusion made me more patient with these same struggles in my subjects. Accepting my own need for growth and learning made me more supportive of others' efforts to improve themselves. In my darkest moments as emperor, I felt utterly alone, as if I were the only person who had ever faced such impossible burdens or carried such overwhelming responsibilities. The weight of millions of lives, the complexity of governing an empire, the constant pressure of life and death, decisions. Surely no one else could understand this isolation, this crushing sense of being responsible for everything while controlling nothing. This belief in my unique suffering was itself a source of additional pain. Not only was I struggling with genuine challenges, but I was also struggling with the conviction that my struggles were somehow different from and greater than everyone else's. I had wrapped my pain in a cloak of specialness that separated me from the rest of humanity. The revelation came during a simple conversation with my personal physician. Galen, after a particularly difficult day. The Senate had blocked crucial legislation. Reports had arrived of new barbarian incursions, and I had received news that the plague was spreading to regions we had thought secure. I was describing my frustration when Galen made an observation that changed my perspective forever. "Caesar," he said quietly, "every person I treat carries burdens they believe no one else could understand. The merchant thinks his financial pressures are unique. The soldier believes his fear is shameful because others seem braver. The mother feels alone in her worry for her children. Yet I see the same fundamental struggles in every human heart: the fear of failure, the weight of responsibility, the pain of loss, the uncertainty about the future." His words struck me like lightning. I had been so focused on the external differences between my situation and others, the scope of my responsibilities, the scale of my decisions, that I had missed the internal similarities. At the deepest level, I was experiencing the same human emotions that every person faces when confronted with challenges that feel overwhelming. This realization dissolved my isolation in an instant. I was not alone in some unique form of suffering, but connected to every person who had ever felt the weight of responsibility, the fear of failure, or the pain of making difficult choices. The farmer worried about his crops with the same anxiety I felt about provincial rebellions. The father watching over a sick child experienced the same helplessness I felt when plague ravaged the empire. Understanding this universal nature of struggle transformed how I approached my challenges. Instead of seeing myself as uniquely burdened, I began to see myself as part of the great human community of those who strive to do right in difficult circumstances. This shift from isolation to connection became a source of unexpected strength. I started drawing inspiration from the courage I witnessed in ordinary citizens. The shop owner who rebuilt after a fire showed the same resilience I needed when rebuilding after military defeats. The widow who raised her children alone demonstrated the same perseverance I required when facing political opposition. The soldier who returned to duty despite his wounds embodied the same commitment to service that I needed when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. This recognition of shared struggle also made me a better leader. When I stopped seeing my position as fundamentally different from others, I became more effective at inspiring and guiding people. I could speak to their experiences because I understood that beneath the surface differences, we were all facing variations of the same essential challenges. I began to see the empire not as my personal burden, but as our collective responsibility. Every citizen who worked honestly, every soldier who served faithfully, every parent who raised their children with virtue was contributing to the same great project. I was not carrying the weight alone, but serving as one part of a vast community of people trying to build something worthy and lasting. This understanding also taught me the value of seeking counsel and accepting help. My earlier belief in my unique position had made me reluctant to share burdens or ask for assistance, but recognizing that others had faced similar challenges, albeit in different forms, opened me to learning from their experiences and wisdom. Started regularly consulting not just with senators and generals, but with merchants, farmers, artisans, and soldiers, anyone whose struggles might offer insights into my own. The strategies that helped a craftsman manage difficult customers often applied to managing difficult provinces. The patience that sustained a teacher working with slow students informed my approach to educating inexperienced officials. Most importantly, this recognition of shared humanity kept me humble. The emperor who believed his burdens were unique was prone to self-pity and grandiosity, but the emperor who understood that he was simply one human being among many, facing his particular version of universal challenges, remained grounded in reality and connected to the people he served. When you understand that your struggles are not evidence of your special suffering, but of your common humanity, you stop wasting energy on self-pity and start drawing strength from the vast reservoir of human experience. You realize that countless others have faced similar challenges and found ways to endure, to grow, and even to triumph. Their courage becomes available to you. Their wisdom becomes your inheritance. Their example becomes your guide. Asterisk, asterisk, the greatest transformation in my understanding of suffering came when I realized that my personal pain could become fuel for serving others more effectively. What I had initially seen as obstacles to good leadership, my struggles with loss, doubt, and overwhelming responsibility, actually became the very qualities that made me a more compassionate and wise ruler. Before experiencing deep personal suffering, my responses to others' pain had been largely intellectual. I could analyze problems, devise solutions, and implement policies with efficiency and logic, but I could not truly understand what it felt like to face circumstances that seemed impossible to bear. My sympathy was genuine but shallow, my counsel technically sound but emotionally distant. The death of my children changed this completely. When my daughter Domitia died in infancy, followed years later by my son Agnes, I entered a territory of grief that no amount of philosophical study had prepared me for. The pain was not just emotional but physical, a weight in my chest, a constant ache that colored every moment and made simple tasks feel monumentous. For months, I struggled simply to function. The routine duties of governance felt meaningless. When measured against the magnitude of loss, how could I care about trade disputes when my children would never grow up? How could I focus on military strategy when the people I loved most were beyond all strategy, all protection, all hope? But gradually, I began to notice something unexpected. My own experience of devastating loss was making me more attuned to the suffering of my subjects. When reports came of families displaced by war, I no longer saw them as mere statistics requiring administrative response. I saw parents who might be experiencing the same crushing worry I had felt watching my children's fevered sleep. I saw children who might be feeling the same confusion and fear my surviving children carried. This deeper understanding changed how I approached governance. Instead of simply implementing efficient policies, I began to consider the human cost of every decision. When planning military campaigns, I thought not just about strategic objectives, but about the wives who would become widows and the children who would lose fathers. When designing tax policies, I considered not just revenue requirements, but the impact on families already struggling with their own burdens. My personal experience of helplessness in the face of loss made me more committed to helping others in areas where help was actually possible. I could not bring back my dead children, but I could ensure that other parents had access to the best available medical care. I could not eliminate the grief of loss, but I could create support systems for those facing similar tragedies. The emperorship became less about wielding power and more about channeling my own pain into useful service. Every decision was informed by the question, how can my understanding of suffering help me reduce unnecessary suffering for others? This transformation was not immediate or easy. There were many days when grief made me want to withdraw from public life entirely. The temptation to focus inward, to nurse my wounds and retreat from the world's demands was constant. But I discovered that service to others was actually the most effective medicine for my own pain. When I focused solely on my personal losses, the grief seemed to expand until it filled my entire consciousness. But when I channeled that same emotional intensity toward helping others, establishing hospitals, improving grain distribution, reforming legal procedures to be more just, the pain remained but was transformed into something constructive, rather than destructive. I began to see suffering not as a barrier to effective leadership, but as a qualification for it. Only those who had experienced real loss could truly understand the stakes involved in protecting others from preventable harm. Only those who had felt genuine helplessness could appreciate the responsibility that comes with the power to help. This Understanding extended beyond personal tragedies to every form of struggle. My battles with self-doubt made me more patient with officials who lacked confidence. My experience of making decisions with incomplete information made me more forgiving of others' mistakes. My own struggles with anger and frustration made me more skilled at helping others manage these same emotions. The emperor who had been broken by personal loss became more effective, not less, because that breaking had opened his heart to the full range of human experience. My suffering had not weakened my capacity to serve, but strengthened it, not by making me harder, but by making me more fully human. I learned that the deepest form of healing comes not from having our pain taken away, but from discovering how our pain can be transformed into wisdom that serves others. When we find ways to use our struggles to reduce others' struggles, our own suffering becomes meaningful rather than merely tragic. The scars remained, but they became sources of strength rather than weakness. The wounds healed, but they left me more sensitive to others' wounds rather than less. The brokenness was transformed, but into greater wholeness rather than mere repair. Asterisk, there is a scar on my left shoulder from a Germanic spear that nearly ended my life during a reconnaissance. Mission gone wrong. For years, I saw it as simply an ugly reminder of poor tactical judgment and worse luck. But as I grew older and wiser, I began to understand that some wounds are not meant to heal completely. They are meant to be honored as sacred marks of our transformation. The incident happened during the early years of the Marcomannic Wars. Against the advice of my guards, I had insisted on personally scouting enemy positions near the Danube. I believed that an emperor should share the dangers he asked others to face, and that first-hand observation would yield better intelligence than second-hand reports. The ambush came without warning. Germanic warriors emerged from concealed positions in the forest, surrounding our small party before we could retreat. In the chaos of combat, a spear meant for my heart struck my shoulder instead, spinning me from my horse and driving deep into muscle and bone. I remember lying on the forest floor, blood pooling beneath me, watching my guards fight desperately to reach my position. The pain was extraordinary, not just physical, but existential. Here was the Emperor of Rome, supposedly protected by divine favor and human loyalty, bleeding out in barbarian territory like any common soldier. In that moment of extremity, something fundamental shifted in my understanding. All my philosophical training, all my careful preparation for leadership, all my theories about virtue and duty, none of it had prepared me for the raw reality of mortality pressing against my throat. I was not a philosopher king in that forest clearing. I was simply a wounded animal, dependent entirely on others for survival. My guards did reach me, and skillful field surgery saved my life. But the recovery was long and painful, made worse by infection that set in during the journey back to our base. For weeks, I drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes unsure whether I was dead or alive. During those delirious periods, I experienced visions that were more real than reality. I saw myself from outside my body, lying pale and still, while physicians worked frantically to keep fever from claiming what the spear had missed. I saw the empire continuing without me, other hands making the decisions I had thought only I could make. I saw that Marcus Aurelius, the individual, was far less important than Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, had believed. When I finally recovered enough to think clearly, I expected to feel diminished by this brush with death. Instead, I felt enlarged. The wound had opened more than flesh, it had opened my understanding of what it meant to be human, mortal, and utterly dependent on forces beyond my control. The scar that remained became a daily reminder of this hard-won wisdom. Every morning when I dressed, I saw the mark that told the story of my vulnerability and my survival. It reminded me that I was not invincible, that leadership was a privilege that could be taken away in an instant, and that my time was limited, and therefore precious. But the scar taught me something even more important, that our deepest wounds often become our greatest sources of strength. The emperor who had never faced death personally could not truly understand the weight of sending others to face it. The leader who had never experienced complete helplessness could not appreciate what it meant to depend on others. Courage and skill. My wound had initiated me into mysteries that could not be learned through study or contemplation. I now knew in my bones what it felt like to stare into the abyss, to feel life ebbing away, to be utterly at the mercy of circumstances beyond control. This knowledge made me a different kind of leader, more humble, more grateful, more aware of the preciousness of every moment. I began to see that life deliberately wounds us in specific ways to teach us specific lessons. The merchant's bankruptcy teaches him about resilience. The parent's loss teaches her about love's true nature. The soldier's injury teaches him about courage and community. Each sacred wound carries its own curriculum, its own gift of wisdom. This understanding changed how I viewed not just my own suffering, but suffering in general. Instead of seeing pain as purely negative, something to be avoided, minimized, or quickly overcome, I began to recognize it as potentially transformative. Not all suffering serves a purpose, but suffering that is consciously embraced and integrated can become a source of profound wisdom and strength. The key is learning to distinguish between wounds that are merely destructive and wounds that are sacred, those that break us open to new understanding rather than simply breaking us down. Sacred wounds are recognized not by their intensity but by their fruits. They make us more compassionate, more wise, more connected to our essential humanity. My shoulder scar became a talisman of this truth. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by challenges or disconnected from my deeper purpose, I would touch that raised ridge of flesh and remember the forest clearing where I learned that vulnerability and strength are not opposites, but partners in the dance of authentic living. After years of being broken down by circumstance and rebuilt by wisdom, I finally understood that recovery is not about returning to who we were before, but about consciously constructing who we choose to become. Like an architect designing a building to withstand earthquakes, I learned to rebuild my life with intentional strength rather than naive optimism. The process began with a simple but profound recognition. The person I had been before my trials was not the person I wanted to be after them. The young emperor who ascended the throne in 161 AD had been well-meaning but untested, philosophical but inexperienced, confident but brittle. That version of myself needed to be broken down so that something stronger could take its place. I began the reconstruction by identifying which peer elements of my former self were worth preserving and which needed to be completely rebuilt. My commitment to virtue remained intact indeed. It had been strengthened by trials that proved its worth. My devotion to serving the common good had survived every test. My love of wisdom had deepened rather than diminished. But other aspects of my character required fundamental renovation. My need for others' approval had been a weakness that compromised my judgment. My attachment to specific outcomes had made me brittle when plans failed. My belief that good intentions would be rewarded with good results had left me unprepared for a world where virtue often goes unrewarded and vice frequently prospers. The rebuilding process was methodical and deliberate. Each morning, I would begin with the question, what kind of person do I choose to be today? This was not about mood or feeling, but about conscious intention. Regardless of external circumstances, I could choose to embody certain qualities: patience when dealing with difficult people, courage when facing uncertain situations, justice when making decisions that affected others. I developed specific practices to reinforce these choices. When anger arose, I would pause and ask whether expressing it would serve any constructive purpose. When disappointment threatened to overwhelm me, I would redirect my attention to what remained possible rather than dwelling on what had been lost. When fear whispered that challenges were too great to overcome, I would focus on the next single step rather than the entire journey. This conscious reconstruction extended to how I approached relationships, responsibilities, and goals. Instead of seeking relationships that made me feel good about myself, I sought relationships that challenged me to become better. Instead of accepting responsibilities that enhanced my status, I embraced responsibilities that served genuine needs. Instead of pursuing goals that would impress others, I focused on objectives that aligned with my deepest values. The key insight was that we are not passive victims of our experiences, but active architects of our character. Every challenge is raw material that can be used to build strength, wisdom, or resilience. Every setback provides information about which aspects of our approach need refinement. Every success reveals which practices are worth continuing and expanding. I learned to view my life as an ongoing construction project rather than a finished product. Each day brought opportunities to add new capabilities, strengthen existing foundations, or repair damage from recent storms. Some days the progress was dramatic breakthrough insights that revolutionized my approach to old problems. Other days the work was subtle, small adjustments in attitude that accumulated into significant character development over time. This perspective transformed how I dealt with future crises. Instead of seeing them as threats to my carefully constructed peace of mind, I began to see them as opportunities to test and strengthen the character I was building. Each new challenge became a chance to practice the virtues I was developing, to apply the wisdom I had gained, and to discover areas that still needed work. The rebuilt Marcus Aurelius was not invulnerable. He was antifragile. Instead of merely surviving stress, he grew stronger from it. Instead of simply enduring hardship, he extracted value from it. Instead of just recovering from setbacks, he used them as stepping stones to higher levels of capability and understanding. Most importantly, I discovered that this process of conscious reconstruction was not a one-time event, but an ongoing way of life. We are always being broken down by experience and always being given the opportunity to rebuild ourselves more wisely. The question is not whether we will face challenges that test us, but whether we will use those challenges to become the people we are capable of becoming. The emperor who emerged from this process was fundamentally different from the one who had begun it, not because circumstances had changed him, but because he had chosen to use circumstances as tools for deliberately reshaping himself. The external Marcus Aurelius looked much the same, but the internal architecture had been completely redesigned for strength, flexibility, and endurance. In my final years as emperor, I came to understand that life is not a straight line from struggle to resolution, but a spiral where the same fundamental challenges return again and again at deeper levels. The brokenness I had learned to transform did not disappear forever. It returned in new forms, requiring me to apply my hard-won wisdom in fresh circumstances. This realization first struck me during a moment that should have been triumphant. After 15 years of warfare, we had finally secured a lasting peace with the Germanic tribes. The borders were stable, the legions were returning home, and Rome could focus on internal development rather than external threats. I should have felt vindicated, relieved, perhaps even proud of what we had accomplished through such tremendous cost. Instead, I found myself facing a familiar emptiness. The great project that had defined my reign was complete, but completion brought not satisfaction, but a strange sense of loss. Without the immediate pressures of war, I was confronted once again with fundamental questions about purpose, meaning, and mortality that I thought I had resolved years earlier. The depression that followed was different from my earlier struggles, but recognizably part of the same family. It was as if my psyche operated on cycles, periodically returning to core themes that required fresh examination. The difference was that now I had tools and perspective that my younger self had lacked. I recognized this return not as a failure of my previous growth, but as evidence of life's cyclical nature. Just as the seasons return each year with similar patterns but unique characteristics, our internal challenges revisit us with familiar themes expressed through new circumstances. The question is not how to prevent this eternal return, but how to meet it with greater wisdom each time. The peace that followed the Germanic wars brought its own unique challenges. Soldiers who had found meaning in common struggle now struggled to find purpose in civilian life. Officials who had developed skills for crisis management found themselves adrift in periods of stability. The entire empire had to learn how to thrive during peace after decades of defining itself through conflict. I realized that my personal experience of cyclical challenge was reflected in the larger rhythms of civilization itself. Nations, like individuals, face recurring cycles of growth and decline, strength and vulnerability, unity and fragmentation. Understanding these patterns does not eliminate them but allows us to navigate them more skillfully. This understanding changed how I approached both personal and imperial challenges. Instead of seeking permanent solutions to temporary problems, I focused on developing sustainable responses to recurring themes. Instead of trying to eliminate all sources of difficulty, I worked to build resilience that could handle whatever forms difficulty might take. I began to see my role not as someone who had overcome brokenness once and for all, but as someone who had learned to dance with brokenness whenever it returned. Each new cycle brought opportunities to apply previous lessons while discovering new dimensions of old truths. The Germanic tribes that we had defeated would eventually be replaced by new tribal confederations. The plague that had finally run its course would eventually be followed by new epidemics. The political stability we had achieved would eventually give way to new forms of instability. But none of this was cause for despair, was simply the nature of existence itself. Accepting the eternal return of challenge liberated me from the exhausting fantasy that there would come a time when all problems were solved and no further growth was required. Instead, I could focus on building the kind of character that remained strong and flexible regardless of what specific challenges might arise. This perspective also made me more patient with others who were facing struggles I had encountered before. Instead of being frustrated by their apparent inability to learn from my example, I understood that each person must walk their own spiral path, encountering familiar challenges at their own pace and in their own unique circumstances. Most importantly, I learned to find beauty in the very patterns that had once seemed like cruel repetition. The eternal return of spring after winter is not monotonous, but miraculous. The cyclical return of challenge after peace is not punishment, but opportunity, a chance to apply what we have learned while discovering what we still need to learn. When you understand that life operates in cycles rather than straight lines, you stop expecting permanent victories and start appreciating temporary ones. You stop being surprised by the return of old challenges and start being curious about what new wisdom they might teach. You stop seeing patterns as prisons and start seeing them as dances in which you can participate with increasing skill and grace. As I approach the end of my reign and feel mortality pressing closer each day, I find myself thinking not about the monuments I will leave behind, but about the invisible legacy that matters most, the wisdom that comes from being broken and rebuilt. This knowledge, harder won than any military victory, is what I most want to pass on to those who will face their own seasons of brokenness. The irony is profound. The aspects of my reign that I once thought would define my legacy, the military campaigns, the legal reforms, the architectural projects, will likely be forgotten or attributed to other causes within a few generations. But the insights that emerged from my deepest struggles, the understanding that grew from my moments of greatest vulnerability, these contain truths that transcend time and circumstance. I have watched this pattern repeat throughout my reign with others who faced severe trials. The general who lost everything in a disastrous campaign but learned humility became a more effective leader than he had ever been in victory. The senator who suffered public disgrace but used the experience to examine his character emerged as one of our most principled legislators. The merchant who lost his fortune but discovered his values built something more meaningful than wealth. Each person who allows brokenness to teach rather than simply wound them becomes a carrier of essential wisdom. They understand what cannot be taught through books or lectures, that resilience is built through practice, not theory, that strength often looks like vulnerability, that the capacity to endure comes from accepting rather than resisting difficulty. This understanding creates a special kind of authority, not the authority of rank or achievement, but the authority of authentic experience. When someone who has genuinely struggled offers guidance to others facing similar challenges, their words carry weight that comes not from position but from proven wisdom. They have been where others fear to go and returned with maps for the journey. I see this clearly in my interactions with young officers facing their first major military setbacks. Those who have never experienced significant failure often offer advice that sounds logical but feels hollow. But when a veteran who has led men to defeat and learned from that defeat speaks about resilience, every word resonates with earned truth. The legacy of the broken is not about displaying scars as badges of honor or dwelling on past sufferings as sources of identity. It is about transforming pain into wisdom that can serve others. It is about using our wounds as windows into universal human experiences that connect us across boundaries of time, culture, and circumstance. This responsibility to share what we have learned through suffering is perhaps the greatest obligation that comes with surviving and growing through difficulty. To keep these insights to ourselves would be a form of spiritual selfishness, hoarding treasures that could benefit others who are still trapped in their own dark nights of the soul. I have tried to fulfill this responsibility through my writings, my decisions as emperor, and my daily interactions with those around me. When I see someone paralyzed by perfectionism, I share how my own need for flawless outcomes nearly destroyed my ability to act at all. When I encounter someone devastated by failure, I describe how my greatest defeats became the foundation for my most important victories. But beyond specific advice or consolation, the most important gift we can offer is simply the evidence of our survival and growth. Our very existence as people who have been broken and become stronger provides hope to others that their current struggles are not permanent conditions, but temporary states that can be transformed through time, effort, and wisdom. This is why vulnerability in leadership is not weakness but strength. When those in positions of authority acknowledge their struggles and share how they have learned from difficulty, they give permission for others to do the same. They create cultures where brokenness is seen as a normal part of human experience, rather than a shameful secret to be hidden. I have come to understand that the most enduring legacies are not carved in stone, but written in the character of those we influence. The emperor who shares his struggles honestly may inspire future leaders to approach their challenges with greater wisdom and courage. The parent who speaks openly about overcoming adversity may give their children tools for facing their own inevitable difficulties. The broken who allow their breaking to make them more compassionate, more wise, and more connected to others create ripples that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. They become part of an ancient lineage of those who have faced the worst that life can offer and emerged not just intact, but enhanced. This is the legacy I hope to leave, not just the evidence that one man learned to transform suffering into strength, but the proof that such transformation is possible for anyone willing to embrace their brokenness as a teacher rather than an enemy. In a world that often presents strength and vulnerability as opposites, perhaps the most revolutionary legacy is demonstrating that they are actually partners in the creation of authentic human greatness. After 2 decades of learning to transform brokenness into strength, I have developed practices that allow me to live with unshakable inner peace, regardless of external circumstances. These are not theoretical exercises, but practical tools forged in the fire of real experience, tested by genuine crisis, and refined through daily application. Each morning, before the demands of empire intrude upon my consciousness, I spend time in what I call the discipline of preparation. This is not passive meditation, but active training for whatever challenges the day might bring. I remind myself that today I will encounter difficult people, frustrating circumstances, and situations beyond my control. More importantly, I remind myself that these encounters are opportunities to practice virtue rather than obstacles to happiness. This morning preparation is like a soldier checking his armor before battle. I examine my motivations, clarify my priorities, and align my will with what is actually possible rather than what I might prefer. By the time I emerge from this private time, I am ready to meet whatever the day brings, not as a victim of circumstance, but as an active participant in my own character development. Throughout the day, I practice what I call the discipline of perspective. When immediate pressures threaten to overwhelm me, I step back and view the situation from multiple vantage points. How will this crisis appear in a month, a year, a decade? What would an ideal sage advise in this situation? What opportunity for virtue does this challenge contain? This shift in perspective is not about minimizing genuine problems, but about seeing them clearly rather than through the distorting lens of immediate emotion. Most crises that feel overwhelming in the moment prove manageable when viewed from the right distance. Most problems that seem unique and catastrophic are actually variations on themes that humans have faced successfully throughout history. When difficult emotions arise and gurr at incompetent officials, grief over losses, fear about uncertain outcomes, practice what I call the discipline of observation. Instead of being swept away by these feelings or trying to suppress them, I watch them with curiosity and compassion. Notice, I tell myself, how anger creates tension in the shoulders. Observe how fear constricts breathing. See how grief feels heavy in the chest. This practice of emotional observation creates space between myself and my reactions. I am not my anger, my fear, or my grief. I am the consciousness that experiences these states. This space allows me to choose my response rather than being compelled by automatic reactions. I can acknowledge emotions without being controlled by them, feel deeply without losing my equilibrium. In my interactions with others, I practice the discipline of service. Instead of focusing on what others can do for me or how they might disappoint me, I ask what I can offer them. How can I help this confused official see his situation more clearly? How can I respond to this critic in a way that serves the greater good? How can I use this conflict as an opportunity to model better ways of handling disagreement? This shift from expectation to contribution transforms every relationship from a potential source of frustration into an opportunity for meaningful connection. When we focus on giving rather than getting, we become less vulnerable to disappointment and more capable of genuine influence. At the end of each day, I practice the discipline of review, not the harsh self-judgment that once characterized my reflections, but honest assessment aimed at continuous improvement. What did I handle well today? Where did I fall short of my own standards? What can I learn from today's experiences that will help me respond more wisely tomorrow? This evening practice serves multiple purposes. It reinforces positive behaviors by acknowledging them consciously. It identifies areas for improvement without the emotional charge that makes change difficult. Most importantly, it maintains the perspective that each day is both complete in itself and part of a larger project of character development. These practices have become so integrated into my daily routine that they require no special effort or time. They are like breathing automatic responses that maintain my inner equilibrium just as breathing maintains my physical health. They allow me to remain centered in chaos, peaceful in conflict, and strong in adversity, not through superhuman effort, but through consistent application of principles proven effective by experience. The key insight is that living unbroken is not about avoiding difficulties, but about developing sustainable ways of meeting them. It is not about feeling strong every moment, but about choosing strength regardless of feeling. It is not about eliminating all sources of stress, but about building the kind of character that can handle stress without being damaged by it. When these practices become habitual, you discover that you can face anything life brings without losing your essential peace of mind. External circumstances may change constantly, but your inner equilibrium remains stable. You become like a mountain that remains unmoved by storms, while allowing wind and rain to flow around its slopes. As I write these final words, knowing that my time grows short, and that soon another will wear the purple, I want to leave you with the most important truth I have discovered. You are far stronger than you believe, and your current brokenness is not evidence of weakness, but proof of your capacity for transformation. The emperor you have been listening to, the man who learned to find strength in vulnerability, wisdom in failure, and peace in chaos, was not born with these capabilities. I was broken by the same forces that may be breaking you now. Overwhelming responsibility, devastating loss, the weight of others' expectations, and the gap between my ideals and reality. Every principle I have shared came at the cost of genuine suffering. The inner citadel was built from the rubble of my naive confidence. The discipline of perception was forged in the fire of military disasters. The strength of acceptance grew from the ashes of my need to control everything. The compassion for self emerged from the ruins of my merciless self-judgment. You who feel broken now carry within you the same capacity for transformation that I discovered within myself. Your pain is not punishment, but preparation. Your struggles are not evidence of your inadequacy, but raw material for your greatness. Your moments of feeling completely overwhelmed are not signs that you are failing, but invitations to discover strength you never knew you possessed. The path forward is not complicated, though it is demanding. Begin where you are, with what you have, facing whatever circumstances currently surround you. You need no special qualifications, no perfect conditions, no guarantee of success. You need only the willingness to see your challenges as opportunities rather than obstacles. When the weight of responsibility feels crushing, remember that this weight can forge unbreakable strength. When loss threatens to devastate you completely, remember that grief is love with nowhere to go, and love never diminishes us, only changes form. When failure makes you question everything about yourself, remember that failure is simply information about what doesn't work, clearing the path toward what does. Build your own inner citadel through daily practice of observing your thoughts and choosing your responses. Develop your own discipline of perception by separating events from your interpretations of events. Cultivate your own acceptance by focusing your energy on what you can influence rather than what you cannot control. Practice compassion toward yourself as you would toward any friend facing similar challenges. Most importantly, understand that becoming unbroken is not a destination, but a way of traveling. You will face new challenges, experience fresh losses, encounter different forms of brokenness, but each time you will meet these experiences with greater wisdom, deeper strength, and more refined skill. The cycles will continue, but you will dance with them rather than being crushed by them. Remember that this wisdom is not mine alone, belongs to everyone who has ever faced the choice between being destroyed by difficulty or transformed by it. It flows through every person who has discovered that their deepest wounds can become their greatest sources of strength. It lives in everyone who has learned that true power comes not from avoiding brokenness, but from consciously rebuilding something better from the pieces. You are part of this ancient lineage now. Your struggles connect you to every emperor and every common citizen who has ever faced overwhelming challenges and chosen growth over surrender. Your capacity to transform pain into wisdom makes you nobility in the truest sense, regardless of your external circumstances. Carry these principles forward into whatever comes next. Trust in your ability to meet difficulty with virtue, to find meaning in struggle, and to create strength from brokenness. The emperor within you apart, that can rule over your inner kingdom with wisdom and justices, more real and more lasting than any external title or achievement. When you feel broken, remember this: you are not broken beyond repair, but ready for reconstruction. You are not failing, but learning. You are not weak, but in the process of becoming stronger than you ever imagined possible. This is my final gift to you. Not the comfort of easy answers, but the knowledge that you possess everything needed to transform your trials into triumphs, your brokenness into unshakable strength, your struggles into the very foundation of a life lived with purpose, virtue, and authentic power. The eternal emperor lives not in Rome, but in every human heart that chooses courage over comfort, growth over safety, and virtue over convenience. That emperor is you.